Senator Kennedy is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks.
Senator Kaine.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses here today. Professor Painter, on May 5th of this year, you put out a tweet. You said, I'm going to quote, "There are some things money can't buy. For everything else, there's the Supreme Court." Would you tell me which members of the Supreme Court you believe are bought?
I was particularly concerned at that point when I posted that tweet.
I understand, but if you could, I've got really limited time, and I apologize for interrupting. Just tell me which members of the court you are bought.
I did not think that Justice Clarence Thomas should be failing to disclose his trips on a billionaire's
Do you think
yacht
he's
and
bought?
airplane.
Do you think he's bought?
I believe that there is grave risk.
Do you think he's bought?
I said there is grave risk
Do you think he's bought?
to the confidence of the American people in our Supreme
Well, if you
Court.
don't think he's bought, why did you say it?
I said
Yes,
that
you said members of the Supreme Court are bought. You're here testifying as an expert for my Democratic friends, and you're saying the members of the Supreme Court are bought?
I said when the American people feel that way, when we have Supreme Court justices
feel that way?
on yachts and in planes of billionaires and not being disclosed.
Anybody besides Justice Thomas you think is bought on the Supreme Court?
I believe that the court needs to clean
Anybody
up
besides
its act.
Justice Thomas?
I'm not going to go through each
I mean,
justice.
you tweeted it.
I tweeted the way the American people feel.
Did you mean
the way
it when
I
you
feel.
tweeted it?
And I stand by that tweet. This Supreme Court of the United States
right.
needs to clean up its
Let me
act.
ask you a couple others here, because you've on September 17, 2020, you tweeted, "It looks like Putin's favorite senator could lose," referring to Senator Lindsey Graham. Could you tell me your evidence for saying that Senator Graham is President Putin's favorite senator?
I don't recall that tweet and the story.
Well, I've got it. It's
tweeted
right
out.
here. It's right here.
I'm happy to look at the tweet, and I'm happy to write you, explain that. I don't know what that has to do with climate change.
Well,
Subject of
it
this
has to
hearing.
do with your credibility. Did you say, what is your basis for saying that Senator Graham is President Putin's? I mean, have you ever talked to President Putin?
I have not talked to President Putin, and I would be happy to go look at the tweet and look at the story that I tweeted out and what Senator Graham had said in that context. You know, this is something
you say all this stuff. For example, you're here as an expert for my Democratic friends, and you say all this stuff. You called on September 16, 2023, a professor at the University of Chicago, very distinguished professor, Brian Leiter. You called him a racist. Can you explain to me why you think he's a racist?
I remember a series of tweets with him. He's a Marxist who put out a number of statements attacking African Americans and women. And he also was raising money for someone who had called the police on a black student for sleeping in the common room, and now has a wokekkk.com website attacking
That's
me.
fair enough.
So
Fair enough.
I will just say one thing that I learned in high school debate, that when you have no argument, you simply change the subject.
All right. On October 15th of 2020, you said Lindsey Graham is soliciting cash payments in return for voting on a Supreme Court nomination. What evidence, that's a pretty bold statement, Professor. What evidence do you have for alleging that Senator Graham was taking cash in return for one of his votes?
I don't recall that specific tweet,
Here it
but
is,
I
right
do.
here. Here it
I
is.
do recall. And I
Do you think he was taking cash for one of his votes?
I have received campaign.
Do you think he was taking cash for one of his votes?
I'm answering your question, Senator. I have received solicitations from both political parties.
Do you think Lindsey Graham was
confirmation
taking
hearings
cash
for
for one of his votes? It's a simple question,
I am
Professor.
received cash, solicitations for cash on my email. And yes, from both political parties in connection with Supreme Court confirmation votes.
Well, I'm out of
It's
time,
wrong.
but let me just say for the record,
It's wrong.
my aunt's Facebook page has more credibility than you do. I could spend the rest of the day reading your quotes where you make allegations against people and you can't defend them.
You've said nothing about climate change. You quoted everybody from a Marxist
Senator
to
Kaine.
all sorts of other people. This has absolutely nothing to do with the topic of the hearing, Senator.
Senator Kaine is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two items that I want to talk about. One, some good news. Mr. Painter, you challenged us at the end of your opening testimony, hey, don't just be finger pointing at each other, get something done. And I do think we have to say this hearing is within the still recent aftermath of two really powerful pieces of legislation that Congress has passed to help us battle climate change, to help the United States become leaders in the battle against climate change. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, a number of my colleagues worked hard on this bill, makes significant investments in all kinds of infrastructure. The nation needs it, but including clean energy infrastructure. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which was partisan, it passed by one vote in the Senate, also really rockets the United States ahead in climate leadership by promoting investments in clean energy. We've seen the effect of this in Virginia. Virginia was one of the worst states in the country in terms of any embrace of wind or solar low carbon energy, at the same time as we were one of the states most vulnerable to sea level rise. But now in both wind deployment offshore, Virginia is becoming a leader not only in deploying wind offshore, but also in becoming a hub of manufacturing of offshore wind components, good for the economy. But also in the solar space, Virginia has moved from sort of bottom 10 deployment to top 10. So the efforts of disinformationists notwithstanding, it's not like Congress has just basically accepted the disinformation and gridlocked. We've taken action, and we can debate too hot, too cold, just right, more steps to take. I believe we do need to take more steps. But I do think Congress is acting on this, and we're acting on it in a way that is rocketing ahead great American innovation, creating jobs, putting us in a position where we can encourage others to do the same, a global leadership position, and I think that's important. And then the other point I wanted to make was with respect to something that Mr. Walter said in his testimony, because I don't want anybody watching this to be confused or disinformed. You used a phrase that said the left wants to silence. The left wants to silence speech it doesn't like. We're talking about disclosure. We're not talking about silencing anyone. Dr. Pilkey said it's important to know resources can pervert research. And those resources could come from the left or the right or from anywhere or from foreign sources. It could pervert research. And you said it's really important that on research you be able to figure out if there's a conflict of interest. Resources can pervert campaigns. Mr. Painter, you talked about watching it from the George W. Bush administration through and seeing the effect on campaign contributions and dark money perverting campaigns. Research can pervert the reputation of the Supreme Court. When people appearing before the court are hosting members of the court on luxury vacations who then choose not to disclose it, there is a possibility that worries Americans that justice is being perverted. So who would argue that we shouldn't rout out conflicts of interest? And if we can't eliminate them all, at least we can make them transparent so that voters and citizens and legislators and journalists can figure out what's going on. That's why the American public overwhelmingly supports the Disclose Act. If you look at polling, Republican, Independent, Democratic, everybody believes they should have the right to know who's funding campaigns. Even a person who may never go look at the website to determine who's doing it still thinks they have the right to it. And that should they want to, that information should be there for them. And that's why I'll go back to what my colleague, Senator Merkley, was saying. I don't believe for an instant that if you added up the total of dark money, it's a more significant problem on the Democratic side than the Republican side. because all Democrats are very wanting to get rid of dark money because all Democrats support the Disclose Act. And since Mike Castle was defeated in a Republican primary for Senate in Delaware in 2010, I don't think we've had a single Republican member of either the House or the Senate who has been willing to support the Disclose Act. Those who are willing to say, let it all be transparent, are not trying to silence anyone. They're trying to actually provide the best information to everyone. While those who insist upon opacity, insist upon secrecy, resist transparency, they got something to hide. They got something to hide. And so my hope is, I just resonate with what Dr. Pilkey said. We ought to be able to determine, wherever we are, everyday people, journalists, elected official, expert, whether there's a conflict of interest that could threaten the credibility of information that we receive. Everybody ought to be able to determine that. And we get there by doing things like the Disclose Act, and it would be my hope that at some point we would be able to get some Republican votes to back that up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
in America as a result of a smart approach to regulation. Also, according to that report, just 20 of the Trump administration's deregulatory actions were expected to save consumers and businesses about $220 billion per year after they went into full effect. President Biden ran on being a, quote, unifying president, but instead he has used his platform to strip away those regulatory reforms we know were positively impacting the economy and replace them with historic levels of new red tape. The Biden administration wasted no time eliminating deregulatory policies and instead cleared the way for President Biden's radical, costly, and burdensome agenda. The last thing any consumer or business wants to do is spend more time and more money on paperwork. That's something on which we can all agree. With historically high inflation, most consumers and businesses simply don't have extra cash laying around to pay someone to fill out reams more paperwork for them. Fortunately, Republicans in Congress know what a thoughtful, efficient, and results-driven regulatory system looks like. And that's what I and my colleagues in this Republican majority are here to support. This committee and the House majority will continue to hold the Biden administration accountable for its extreme regulatory overreach and pursue legislative solutions to ensure common sense regulatory reform. When America isn't tied down with red tape or buried under heaps of federal paperwork, America's small businesses, workers, and communities are capable of soaring to new heights of prosperity. And with more economic prosperity comes more economic opportunities. And these opportunities will do more to help Americans create, innovate, and thrive than any regulation pushed through by unelected bureaucrats.